Today, we're going to be tackling one of psychology's biggest questions: how much of our behavior is really under our conscious control? And in doing that, I've got some questions for you. Have you ever said something and immediately thought, why did I say that? Or maybe you've had some kind of strong reaction to someone. Could be a positive reaction or a negative, but you don't really know why you have that reaction to them. Or have you ever walked in a room and suddenly felt kind of uneasy, and you couldn't put your finger on why you felt that way? I'm reminding you that those things happen because a lot of what we think and what we feel and what we do is influenced by factors we're not even aware of in that moment of thinking, feeling, and doing. I also want to remind you that Freud was one of the first to argue that unconscious forces shape human behavior. Today, however, many see Freud's theory, the psychodynamic theory, as outdated, and maybe even look at it with a little bit of disdain. Why? Well, some of the reasons people give have been that it lacks scientific evidence. Some say that there's an overemphasis on childhood and sexuality. Some say there's too much subjectivity in its interpretation. Maybe that its therapy is too long and costly. And of course, the rise of cognitive and neuroscientific approaches have become the favorite modern theories of today, right? But here's a twist. Modern cognitive psychology does actually support some of Freud's core ideas. Maybe it's just that we're just really using different terms. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to connect for you Freud's theory of the unconscious mind with the most popular theory believed today, and that's the cognitive theory. And I'm going to use cognitive psychology concepts like implicit bias and automatic processing and priming, to show why psychodynamic theory might not be such a dinosaur after all. Okay, so first, why do people think psychodynamic theory is outdated? Let's look at some of those answers in a little more depth. As I said before, they say that there's a lack of scientific evidence. Yes, modern psychology values empirical, testable research. And many of Freud's ideas lack scientific support. Freud's theories were based also on case studies, not controlled experiments. And there's not really a way to test some of his concepts. Think about the Oedipus complex, for example. Number two, they say he overemphasizes childhood and sexuality. Yes, Freud believed early childhood experiences, particularly related to mothers and sexuality, shaped personality. But we do know that early experiences matter. Research does show us that personality and behavior are shaped by ongoing experiences, genetics, as well as social influences. So that's kind of a weak reason, I think. The third one was, I think, subjectivity and interpretation issues, right? I'm agreeing that many of Freud's concepts, like repressed memories or unconscious conflicts, are difficult to measure objectively. But you know what? We as therapists draw our conclusions all the time on subjective information. Look at the most important assessment we use every time with a client, the clinical interview. There's really no way to divorce our subjectivity in interpreting a client's meaning about what or how or why they say what they say, right? We know that different therapists also might interpret the same behavior in completely different ways. That still exists in today's world. Objectivity, it just cannot be used in every circumstance. It just cannot. Yet we believe what our modern therapists tell us anyway, right? So again, subjectivity, to me, that argument is a little weak. Okay, so let's see. What about the criticism that psychoanalysis is a long and costly therapy? Yes, classical psychoanalysis is long-term, it's expensive, it requires multiple sessions per week for years. Why should we use that when modern therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT are more short-term and structured and scientifically validated? Keep in mind that we do have modern versions of the psychodynamic theory that we use today. Interpersonal psychotherapy, for example. It's a shortened therapy that uses a lot of the same principles as the psychodynamic theory. So there's that. And then probably the most important reason, I think, revolves around the rise of cognitive and neuroscientific approaches. It is true that cognitive psychology and neuroscience have shifted our focus to how the brain processes thoughts and emotions. And we can use brain imaging tools, things like the fMRI or the EEG, to study behavior in ways Freud never could. But brain imaging doesn't tell the whole picture the way talking with someone can, does it? So, if psychodynamic theory is so flawed, why do we continue to talk about it? Why do we continue to teach it? Could one of the reasons be, besides the historical interests of it, because modern research suggests Freud was maybe asking the right questions, even if he didn't have the right methods? I think so. Now, I want to explore how some of Freud's ideas about the unconscious are indeed alive and well in our beloved cognitive psychology. Okay? Okay, just a short review. Freud believed that beneath our conscious awareness, there were hidden mental forces influencing our thoughts, our emotions, and our actions. His key ideas included three main things. One, unconscious drives. These were those things like instincts and urges that we don't always recognize. Number two, repressed conflicts. These were memories and emotions that get pushed out of our awareness. And defense mechanisms are number three. And these are those psychological strategies that our unconscious uses to protect us from uncomfortable truths. Now, one of Freud's most famous examples of a defense mechanisms, the Freudian slip. I have a really great famous example of a Freudian slip, and it occurred with one of our most beloved presidents, Ronald Reagan, when he was giving a speech about the nation's economy at the time. He accidentally said, we are trying to get unemployment to go up, and I'm sure that we will succeed. He quickly corrected himself to say, we're trying to get unemployment down. But Freud would have argued that that slip was really revealing an unconscious truth. Perhaps Reagan didn't believe his administration policies were maybe as effective as he consciously wanted to believe they were. Freud would say, that wasn't just an accident, that was an unconscious thought breaking through. So, here's another funny and relatable example I can share with you. Imagine someone is introducing their boss at a company meeting and accidentally says, I'd like to thank our best boss, Sarah, for her leadership. Freud might say that this particular slip might indicate maybe an unconscious attraction or a repressed thought that surfaced, but it surfaced in the wrong time. Okay, so with that short review of psychodynamic theory, how might we now look at how cognitive psychology supports some of those ideas that Freud introduced, but maybe in a more scientific, rigorous way? Okay, so first, consider implicit bias, the cognitive science of unconscious influence. Modern cognitive psychology has a concept called implicit bias. It means our unconscious attitudes and associations. So let me give you an example of implicit bias. So there are many studies that show even people who strongly believe in gender equality may associate men with leadership more than they do women. This is not a conscious decision. It's It's an unconscious bias, what cognitive psychology would call an implicit bias. This doesn't mean that they're intentionally sexist. It means they're just absorbed into these ideas without even realizing it. That's implicit bias. So what's the connection to Freud? Well, Freud argued that we repress uncomfortable truths. Remember, repression is that unconscious defense mechanism that pushes distressing or uncomfortable feelings or thoughts, especially memories, out of our conscious awareness. And it does this because that's to help us avoid feeling anxious or experiencing some kind of emotional turmoil because of it. Now, could you not say that implicit bias, which operates outside of our awareness, works in a similar way? Also, in cognitive theory, it's said that people deny their biases through such cognitive constructs as cognitive dissonance and cognitive distortions. Remember, cognitive dissonance is that mental discomfort that you experience when your beliefs and your attitudes and your behaviors are misaligned. Cognitive distortions are where patterns of faulty thinking lead people to misinterpret reality. And this really, I don't think, is any different than Freud's defense mechanism of, say, rationalization. Is it? No. So if we were in a face-to-face class right now, I might ask you at this point, can you think of any time in your life where you reacted to a person or a situation in which later you realized it was shaped by something deeper? Maybe an assumption that you weren't aware of, or a childhood experience that you had forgotten about, but they had. Okay, well, I'm sure we all can think of things like that. Now let's talk about how our brains make decisions automatically without even us realizing it. This is about automatic processing and priming. Now, I'm going to tell you a short little story. I used to drive an hour and a half from home to grad school on weekends sometimes. I'd get home and I'd realize, I don't even remember driving a particular stretch of road, but I had to have gotten home. Has that ever happened to you, where you've driven somewhere familiar and suddenly realized, I don't remember making the turns to get here? Well, the cognitive concept of automatic processing explains this. Automatic processing is a concept that explains how our brain carries out tasks without any conscious efforts. It's really an efficiency mechanism that our brain uses to get us through our day. And one of my grad school professors didn't call it automatic processing. He called it being in a trance. And it was really kind of like that. Don't remember something in particular from one point to another. That's a trance. But as you know, Freud said much of our behaviors happen without conscious awareness too. And cognitive psychology now confirms that the early experiences that we have had do create mental shortcuts and shape how we react without consciously realizing it. We process these things unconsciously. In a famous study, it's now famous study, researchers gave participants words relating to aging. These would be words like, I don't know, wrinkle or Florida. Afterward, they found that those participants walked more slowly down a hallway than people who were not exposed to those kinds of words. They had no idea that they were walking slower, but why would that be? Well, their brain had been primed to associate aging with slowness. Priming is another cognitive psychology concept. It refers to when your exposure to a stimulus, what we call a prime, influences how we perceive, how we interpret, how we react to another subsequent stimulus. And that's all without us realizing it. Well, what's Freud's connection here? Okay, Freud also argued that past experiences shape behavior that we have now, even when we don't realize it. This also helps explain a concept of transference in therapy. This is a psychodynamic concept. Transference is when clients kind of unconsciously project past emotions onto their therapist. An example of this might be a client with maybe a distant father who might subconsciously assume their male therapist will also be emotionally unavailable too. That's priming in action. A cognitive therapist would interpret a client with a distant father subconsciously assuming their male therapist would be emotionally unavailable, as an example of cognitive distortions and maladaptive beliefs developed from early life experiences. In this case, the client's past relationship with their father likely formed a core belief that male figures are emotionally distant or unavailable. And now this is being projected onto the therapist. This is just another example of how psychodynamic theory and cognitive theory are not that far apart after all. So let's bring all this together. Number one, psychodynamic theory is often criticized for being unscientific, overly focused on childhood, and being subjective. But modern cognitive psychology shows us that unconscious factors do influence behavior, just maybe in different ways. Number three, while Freud didn't have neuroscience and experiments, modern psychology does support many of his beliefs, whether we like it or not. Now, Freud might have gotten some things wrong, but one thing is clear. He was asking the right questions, and modern psychology continues to explore them today. So based on what I'm sharing with you, I would be asking you in a face-to-face class, do you think Freud was ahead of his time? Or do you think modern psychology has completely moved past his ideas? I'm curious about what you think. Let me know.